El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, and for many years it was drowning in poverty, corruption, and gang violence. Criminals controlled every aspect of ordinary people's lives, and without their backing, you couldn't even get medical help. But everything changed in 2022. In just a few years, the murder rate in the country dropped by more than 80%. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do that one thing under the video in case you forget. The crime rate in El Salvador has always been historically high because of the presence of various gangs, and it's been a severe problem, as in there really were a lot of gangs. For example, in 2011, there were about 25,000 gang members out on the streets and another 43,500 in prison. At the beginning of 2012, an average of 16 murders happened here every day. And in 2015 alone, there were 6,656 murders. In 2016, a bit fewer, 5,269. And then came 2022, and thanks to the crackdown on Salvadoran gangs, crime rates started dropping fast. So much so that El Salvador earned the title of safest country in Central America. Just to give you an idea, in 2024, the country reported a murder rate of 1.9 per 100,000 people, which is lower than in any other Latin American country. Over 9 years, the rate dropped by 98%. There were 495 murders in all of 2022 and just 114 in 2024. The number of murders is the lowest since the Civil War ended in 1992. The murder rate dropped from an alarming 105 per 100,000 people in 2015 to the current 8 per 100,000. That's actually the same rate, by the way, as in the U.S. And now maybe it's time to talk a bit about those very gangs that terrorized El Salvador for decades. The biggest and most well-known are Mara 18 and MS-13. Their business is more or less typical for gangs: extortion, human and substance trafficking, and all sorts of violent crimes. At the same time, the gangs have always been extremely powerful and kept society in fear, controlling many of El Salvador's citizens. People describe living next to gangs as suffocating. The criminals controlled many aspects of life. People constantly had to think about what to say, how to walk, how to look. It was like being next to your enemy all the time, 24/7, with no way out. The gang members got into families, tried to recruit kids and teens as young as 12, and there were thousands of those recruited kids. They also extorted money from businesses, and people who didn't obey the gangs just vanished, and no one ever saw them again. In the end, many Salvadoran citizens, exhausted by endless violence and fear, were forced to flee the country, some of them illegally. And just so you get the idea, besides the 60,000 gang members, around 500,000 people were somehow tied to them, meaning their lives depended on the criminals. Considering the country has a population of 6.3 million, that's 1 in 12 affiliated with the gangs. Something had to be done about it. In March 2022, the administration of current President Nayib Bukele launched a historic crackdown on gang members, declaring a state of emergency. It gave the government almost total freedom in its fight against crime. The army was brought in, soldiers entered ordinary people's homes and looked for gang members by their tattoos. As harsh as it may sound, this led to the arrest of a large number of street-level gang members and their accomplices. Their communications were cut off, substance trafficking chains were disrupted, and even extortion became impossible. The gang hierarchy crumbled, and that by itself threw a wrench into their plans to come up with a collective, organized reaction. In short, the criminals were at a loss. Actually, before President Nayib Bukele came to power, no government had managed to do anything about the gangs. I mean, the authorities did try. Starting from the early 2000s, security forces were arresting gang members by the dozens. Police and soldiers had to push gangs out of poor urban neighborhoods where the government had lost control, but it never really led to any lasting progress. Criminals always found a way to regroup, get revenge, or reorganize their networks to keep working under increased pressure, and then everything went back to the usual levels of violence and killings. But why was it that Bukele's regime turned out to be so effective after so many years of failure? Analysts say it comes down to 3 main things: using extreme legal measures, a looser take on who counts as gang members, and concentrating political power around Bukele's administration. It really worked. The cities got quieter and calmer than ever before, and gang members with tattooed faces and guns got replaced by people in uniform and with weapons. And these people in uniform have the power to do whatever they think is necessary. The work started with the declaration of a state of emergency. Usually it's declared as a temporary measure in response to catastrophic events like natural disasters or pandemics. No government in El Salvador had ever gone down this road to fight gangs, but after a series of brutal killings at the end of March 2022, where 87 people died, lawmakers backing Bukele approved the president's request. The state of emergency was declared for a month and was extended multiple times after that. On March 27, 2025, the state of emergency in El Salvador marked 3 years since it was declared. While the state of emergency is still in effect, the law stripped Salvadorans of basic constitutional rights, including the right to legal protection and freedom of movement. At the same time, rules around arrests are loosened, and the government gets the power to intercept civilian communications. Again, it doesn't sound great, but all these emergency powers allowed security forces to launch a blitzkrieg against the gangs. Criminals and their suspected accomplices were arrested without a warrant or based on anonymous tips. It happened very fast, and the gangs didn't have time to react. In the first 2 months of the state of emergency, security forces arrested more than 33,000 people. The state of emergency also suspended constitutional rights to protection. That means detainees can be held indefinitely on vague charges without needing evidence to back up the criminal accusations. Detained people also lose the right to a court hearing within 72 hours of arrest, and lawyers and civil society groups said they can't talk to those detained. In the end, the arrests were based on unverified raw intel, rumors, and info pulled from social media profiles. In the end, about 80,000 people suspected of gang activity were arrested, many of whom were locked up in the biggest prison in Latin America, which Bukele had built just for this purpose. This prison, called the Terrorism Confinement Center, was opened in January 2023. Today, it's one of the largest prisons in the world by inmate capacity. At the same time, there's no rehabilitation going on here, and the authorities said they don't plan to let anyone out. Though I did come across info that one person did manage to get out. The prison's really huge, covering 57 acres, and locals say they hardly know anything about what goes on inside. But it's known that some of the country's most hardened criminals are held here, including mass murderers and gang members called the worst of the worst. The prison is also sadly known for its harsh conditions. Journalists described the prison like this: cells built for about 80 inmates where men are locked up for 23.5 hours a day with only multi-tiered metal bunks as furniture. No sheets, pillows, or mattresses. There's an open toilet, a cement basin, a plastic bucket for washing, and a big jug of drinking water. Prisoners are only allowed to leave overcrowded cells for 30 minutes a day. The lights stay on all the time, and there's no privacy or comfort. Prisoners don't work. They're not even allowed to read books, play cards, or even get letters from home. Food trays are placed outside the cells and slid through the bars. Meat is never served. The 30-minute daily break is just stepping out into the main hallway for group exercises or Bible reading. It's estimated that there are currently between 10,000 and 20,000 inmates there, and some of them have to live with the thought that they'll never get out. And the Minister of Public Security even said, quote, "We believe in rehab, but just for common criminals. Dangerous gang members definitely don't count." The fight against gangs has led to El Salvador having the highest incarceration rate in the world. 1,086 people per 100,000 in 2023. It's estimated that in 2023, 1.6% of El Salvador's population was behind bars. But considering how many people were in gangs or linked to them, it's not surprising. But the war on hunting down criminals didn't end there. Bukele's administration also rolled out new laws aimed at keeping gang members behind bars. In March 2022, the legislature passed reforms that increased prison terms for gang membership and ruled out house arrest for those inmates. Gangs are basically considered terrorist organizations under Salvadoran law. The reforms also lowered the age to 12 at which people can be charged for gang-related crimes. It sounds terrible, but that's exactly the age when recruitment happened. At the same time, the administration changed existing laws on fighting organized crime to broaden the very idea of being part of a gang. The law on illegal affiliation was changed. Now it covers anyone who promotes, helps, supports, or favors the activities of a criminal organization. As a result, the law, which was already pretty broad, now gives the authorities the right to arrest not just suspects and accomplices, but also potential members and suspected helpers. And the crime itself is defined so broadly in El Salvador's laws that anyone who's had contact with gang members, whether on purpose or not, can be held responsible. So what's the bottom line? Now the authorities can make arrests faster than during previous raids. Gang members and their helpers stay in jail longer. Besides, the authorities can take down large networks made up of both newbies and those nearly out of the game, along with their accomplices. And more people are now considered gang members, all facing longer prison sentences. All this cuts down the chances of gang members coming back onto the streets. Some won't come back ever. Of course, these changes affected the lives of ordinary people too. Before all these measures were put in place, people often needed the gang's permission just to pass through disputed areas. Sometimes, even to get to work or back home after work, permission was required. I've already talked about getting emergency medical help. In many neighborhoods, gangs also controlled the local economy, calling the shots on who, what, and where people could sell. Now, residents admit they no longer face nearly constant watching by criminals or strict movement rules. They've taken back the hangout spots that gangs used to use, and they've even managed to kick off new community projects without any pushback. A police officer working in the historic center of San Salvador, the country's capital, said that gang members disappeared just 2 weeks after the state of emergency was declared. Although before, this place used to be a real hotspot for criminals. Overall, it became clear that the gangs can no longer run the criminal economy. The residents, in turn, said that no one else had been extorting money from them anymore, and one owner of a bus company who used to pay about $6,000 a month to 3 main gangs said he stopped paying right when the crackdown started, and now everything's fine. Plenty of regular people in El Salvador say they could have been gunned down or abducted at any time. You couldn't even just step into a park without worrying about your life. But that's all in the past. Now people can go to community centers and soccer fields that were once shut down. This might be the clearest sign of how fast the decline in gang violence has transformed life for people who went through years of fear. So no wonder the president who beat the gangs now enjoys massive respect. On February 4th, 2024, Bukele was re-elected, winning 83% of the vote. Despite a negative reception outside El Salvador, inside the country, Bukele is seen as one of the most popular presidents in history. His approval rating usually hovers around 90%, and the media call Bukele the most popular leader in Latin America. But of course, there are downsides too. Under the state of emergency that suspended many basic rights, Bukele's regime has arrested over 75,000 suspected gang members, some just for having tattoos. Since then, around 7,000 people have been released due to lack of evidence, but activists say many innocent people, including minors, are still behind bars. Since the state of emergency made official investigations kind of shady, activists stepped in. They look into people's lives, talk to their friends, loved ones, and even casual acquaintances. And so, according to locals and witnesses, some innocent people do get detained, but they never make it out alive. People are scared of patrol cars. Many have family members who just vanished. Parents are left without kids, and kids without parents. According to the Salvadoran organization Socorro Jurídico Humanitario, also known as Humanitarian Legal Aid, out of 75,000 inmates, about 20,000 are innocent. But the authorities aren't listening to calls from human rights groups to review the cases of thousands of innocent people who have no tattoos or criminal records, yet are doing time for nothing. And the famous prison is seen by many as a pretty controversial place. On the one hand, it's praised for holding suspected gang members, but it's also criticized for alleged human rights abuses, including inhumane conditions. All this brings up the question, how long will most Salvadorans keep backing the way the current president runs the country? In the short run, things seem fine, since people enjoy the safety and economic progress, but you can't turn a blind eye to the lack of basic human rights for too long. It's interesting that El Salvador's victory against gangs using emergency measures pushed Honduras to do something along the same lines, but by 2023, a year on, reports didn't show any solid results. It all started the same way. Honduras leader Xiomara Castro declared a state of emergency across the country and stepped up security forces' efforts to wipe out gangs. Still, this had mixed results, and the violence against civilians by criminals didn't go anywhere. More than that, it continued at the same rate. There were also some unexpected consequences. In particular, the organization that monitors data on armed conflicts around the world said that the violence had spread beyond the usual hotspots. Maybe that happened because of increased pressure on gangs in the most densely populated urban areas, so the authorities tried to crush crime, but it just moved elsewhere. Cases of extortion seem to have gone up. In the end, experts came to the conclusion that all the problems of the state of emergency in Honduras came down to poor institutional development, geography, and politics. For example, the country's police are chronically unstable and corrupt. The police also lack the resources to do their job, and some even think that this fight against gangs is just a PR stunt. According to critics, this PR stunt is supposed to create the appearance of the police working as successfully as in El Salvador, rather than actually solving the problems. And judging by the fact that the state of emergency, which lasted a whole year, didn't even come close to showing Salvadoran-level effectiveness, there might be something to it.
You owe me a like. See you later.